The German victory in Western Europe in the spring of 1940 stunned the world. It seemed a miracle because France was considered the most modern army in the world, backed up by Britain, which came second. In this perspective, the entry of France and Great Britain into the war in September 1939 was a major setback for Germany. The invasion of Poland had just begun, and Germany was already entangled in an unanticipated two-front war. The German army was fully committed in the east, while the scarcely occupied West Front was threatened by France and Great Britain. Luckily for Germany, the French stayed behind the Maginot Line, and the Allies didn't even bother to bomb Germany's western industrial areas in the Saar and the Ruhr with their air force. Although the campaign in Poland was over in a matter of weeks, the challenge of confronting France and Britain remained. Germany had several strategic problems to contend with. First, they lost the advantage of a surprise attack. While Germany was dealing with Poland, France and Britain could mobilize their forces at full capacity. By the time the German army was redeployed to the Western Front, the French and British were ready and waiting. Second, the French and British combined had a larger industrial base and pool of manpower than Germany. France and Britain did not only have a substantial workforce at home, but they also could draw manpower and raw materials from their colonies. Third, the German army had to deal with constraints in terms of armaments and manpower. Only roughly 10% of their divisions were motorized to some degree, and a large proportion of their population had no military training whatsoever due to the previous restrictions of the Versailles Treaty. The Germans had, in other words, to rely on a solid battle plan to negate the numerical superiority of the Allies and to maximize the effect of their limited forces. Hitler was acutely aware of the bad strategic situation Germany was in, and as a result he focused on the direction of the most urgent strategic threat, the Low Countries. If the Allies could get access to the ports and airfields of Belgium and the Netherlands, they could use them as a jump-off point to strike at the Ruhr industrial area by land and air. This is probably the reason why he told his generals on September 27, 1939, that he wished for a rapid advance through Belgium to the Channel. He issued a memorandum on October 6 with the following directives: an attack through the Low Countries as soon as possible and with the greatest force, to destroy as much divisions as possible and drive the Allies back from the Channel coast into northern France. The goal was to drive the Allies as far away as possible from Germany and create a jump-off position to invade the French interior. Karl-Heinz Frieser criticizes Hitler's strategic approach in his book on Blitzkrieg as being stuck in a World War I mindset. That's a strange criticism, because he quotes Wilhelm Keitel, who said that Hitler dismissed the first draft plan of attack because he perceived it as a rehash of the Van Schlieffen Plan. The Schlieffen Plan was the German strategic plan to win the war on the Western Front during the First World War, which failed in the summer of 1914. Franz Halder, who was the chief of staff of the German High Command and had devised the first draft, was surprised by Hitler's criticism, because he thought that he had stayed close to Hitler's directive when he presented his plan on October 19th. Halder's plan put the emphasis of the attack on the right wing, with three armies attacking head-on through Belgium with tank forces in support. On October 25th, Hitler held a conference with Halder and Brauchitsch. During this conference, several options of attack were discussed. The most obvious attack was over the plains north of the Meuse between Brussels and Antwerp. During this meeting, Hitler suddenly asked whether an attack south of the Meuse was feasible. He suggested a westward advance south of the Meuse, which would turn northwest to cut off the bulk of the Allied forces in Belgium and the north of France. Following this conference, Hitler sent out a new directive on October 29th, calling for two main thrusts, one north of the axis Liège-Charleroi and one south of that axis. Frieser once again criticizes Hitler's suggestion. The idea of trying two Schwerpunkts at the same time did not amount to much either. The first operations draft at least had one definite Schwerpunkt. In my opinion, the creation of 2 points of main effort should be seen in the context of Hitler's style of decision making, which was in the form of conferences where different options were being discussed with his generals. By inserting the advance south of the Meuse through the Ardennes, in a directive he gives his generals the incentive to study the feasibility of this option. And Hitler's thought process was far from over. 2 weeks later, on November 11th, Hitler proposed to add another third Schwerpunkt with Guderian's motorized corps towards Sedan, where the strategic breakthrough would actually take place in May 1940. Frieser is highly critical of this proposal, but that meant 3 main points of effort simultaneously. In other words, the Schwerpunkt was everywhere and nowhere. There was, however, a plausible reason behind Hitler's thinking. He stated that it was better to decide on the point of main effort after the kickoff of the offensive in order to determine the best course of action in anticipation of the developing situation. Again, Frieser criticizes Hitler's decision. Hitler thus violated one of the most important basic principles of Blitzkrieg, the principle of concentration. The principle of concentration is, however, the basis of any attack and as such not limited to Blitzkrieg. I would argue that having multiple thrusts makes strategic sense insofar that it doesn't give away your main point of effort right away. It forces the enemy to disperse its forces and potentially concentrate his forces in the wrong sector. Ironically, Frieser later in his book brings up the strategy of maneuver a posteriori, which was popular in the French and British army around 1900. This strategy was a flexible approach towards battle, in which the main course of action would be decided after the start of an offensive, depending on the development of the situation and when the intentions of the enemy would become clear. The fact that Hitler inadvertently uses it speaks for his flexibility of mind, contrary to that of his senior generals so far. The German generals at the time had cold feet regarding an offensive. This was completely understandable because they faced the two armies which were considered the best in the world in terms of equipment and training. Hitler was aware of the gloomy atmosphere among his top generals and he decided to address his top brass on November 23rd. By the end of his speech, he describes his attitude to the war as follows. Without attack, this war is not to be ended victoriously. I consider it as possible to end the war only by means of an attack. The question as to whether the attack will be successful, no one can answer. As a prerequisite, however, is that the leadership must give an example of fanatical unity from above. Hitler did, however, eventually choose a main point of effort before the start of the campaign. When he exactly came to this decision is a matter of debate. It is commonly thought that Hitler made up his mind after a personal meeting with Manstein on February 17th. On February 13th, Hitler had actually already instructed Jodl that Sedan would be the main point of effort. Frieser regards Hitler's judgments as almost accidental. He expresses his thoughts as follows. Manstein was concerned with the strategic question as to how one could achieve a total decision. Hitler's considerations were aimed primarily at the opposite bank of the Meuse River. Manstein was thinking all the way to the Channel coast. This is odd, because earlier in his work, Frieser criticized Hitler for his focus on the Channel and its ports, as we have discussed earlier. In this particular remark, Frieser derides Hitler as a military amateur who can't think the idea of a breakthrough at Sedan through to the end, but he makes the mistake to confuse the roles of the different players. It's not up to the head of state to come up with a plan for the campaign. That's the job of his generals. Frieser is correct that Hitler created the bad strategic situation for Germany by triggering a declaration of war with Britain and France as a result of his invasion of Poland. But it is politics which decides foreign policy, and it's up to the military to prepare for potential conflict. Frieser's central thesis that Germany was not prepared for a conflict with France and Britain is correct. He also correctly puts the blame on Hitler's wrong assessment of the international reaction on his invasion of Poland. But it is quite astonishing that the German military had no plan whatsoever. The outbreak of war was preceded by months of international tensions. In the light of rising tensions between Germany and the Western powers since the Sudeten crisis in the autumn of 1938, it is quite surprising that nothing had been prepared for eventual military operations in the West. The German top generals were not only rather complacent and clueless, but even resisted an alternative plan when presented. When Manstein came up with his plan for a breakthrough at Sedan and a race to the Channel coast, the German army generals withheld the plan from Hitler by posting Manstein away from the Western Front. When Hitler was informed by Manstein on February 17th, he embraced the plan instantly. One of the principal reasons for his quick conversion was the fact that Hitler already had started thinking along similar lines as Manstein for several months. A speedy advance to cross the Meuse and a subsequent breakthrough to the French hinterland. Hitler did not invent the sickle-cut plan, but he put his weight behind it as a political leader, and that was his role. And this was also the decisive factor, because the generals kept resisting the idea even after its adoption by Hitler. Rundstedt, the commander of Army Group A, the army group tasked with the Sedan breakthrough, expressed that spearheading an offensive with tanks is no longer justified under current circumstances. And if that wasn't enough, Rundstedt's chief of staff von Schoenstern began a campaign to criticize the plan devised by Manstein and endorsed by Hitler. By March 5th, he had drafted a memorandum summarizing his criticism. First, he judged the hilly and forested Ardennes as practically impassable for large columns of tanks. He pointed out that due to the hilly and wooded area, vehicles would be bound to the scarce roads, which could easily be blocked or mined. Second, he anticipated that enemy resistance would start on the Belgian border and would soon be joined by French forces. The German advance would seriously be delayed or even blocked. Third, German columns on the Ardennes road would be vulnerable for Allied air raids. Even if the Allies managed to destroy a fraction of the vehicles, it would block the roads for further traffic and grind the advance to a complete standstill. Fourth, even if the tank forces could make it through the Ardennes under the most favorable circumstances, the Meuse River would prove an insurmountable obstacle, especially on French territory. The French had been manning and fortifying the Meuse embankment for months. Tanks could not hope to ford the river or break through the defenses independently, not without the sizable support of sufficient infantry and heavy artillery. The opposition to Manstein's plan was not confined to Rundstedt's headquarters. This became clear when Hitler summoned all generals of the army group down to army commanders to a conference in the Reichschancellery in Berlin on March 15th. Kleist and Guderian were also invited and an open argument broke out. The generals called the plan crazy and foolhardy. At some stage, Guderian was asked by Hitler to explain how he would deploy his forces, especially after the Meuse crossing. This provoked the cynical remark by General Busch that Guderian would not manage to cross the Meuse. Guderian replied that this was not the concern of Busch. Meanwhile, the French commander Maurice Gamelin was playing into the hands of the Germans by adding the Breda version of the Allied advance into the Low Countries on March 20th. Originally, the French 7th Army was located near Reims as a strategic reserve. Of course, the French had other forces at hand in the Sedan sector, but the 7th Army consisted of high-grade units. If these would have been thrown into the fray, these would have caused the Germans a lot of trouble at Sedan. Such a force would have made a German breakout in this sector almost impossible. Gamelin's move to reinforce his left flank was the climax of a continual increasing emphasis on the left flank. The so-called Deile plan was the root of this left emphasis and foresaw a buttressing of the Belgian army behind the river Deile, between roughly Antwerp and Brussels. The initial Deile plan consisted of just 15 Allied divisions, but Gamelin decided to extend the Deile plan to the north towards Breda to link up with the Dutch defences. In May 1940, the number of divisions intended for the Deile plan had doubled to 30 Allied divisions, including France's original Field Army Reserve, the 7th Army. In the final German plan to break through at Sedan and race for the Channel coast, these divisions would be trapped. These forces did not only constitute a large part of the Allied army, but also its finest part. The initial Deile plan, with the relative weak Allied left flank, shows that Hitler's initial plan in October 1939 was not all that bad, at least not as bad as Frieser would like us to believe. This plan wanted to put the main effort on the right flank, through northern Belgium, sweeping the Allied armies before them and aiming for the Channel ports. We should keep in mind that in May 1940 the Allies in general did not manage to hold the Germans in that sector in any significant way. Even if the Germans would have been halted at the River Meuse between Sedan and Namur, the Germans broke through the Deile line in May 1940 without armoured support. And this line was meant to be the Allied main line of defense, where the best elements of both armies were concentrated. The Germans also crossed the Scheldt River without much difficulty. The German attack would have had even more impact with the support of armor, as intended in the original plan October 1939, and with an initially much weaker Allied left flank. All of this would have most likely triggered a British withdrawal from the continent, as they needed their forces to defend the British homeland from a potential German invasion from the Low Countries. This would have left France to fend for itself and a wide open left flank. The initial plan in the autumn of 1939 would in other words have struck the Allied weak point, just as the plan for the spring of 1940 struck the Allied weak point at that period of time. The outcome of the Western Front campaign would probably not have been much different from that of May 1940 if the German forces had been ready, because the main factors that kept Germany from attacking in October 1939 were the moving of the main body of their army from Poland to the west and the necessary replenishment and recovery of their forces from the Polish campaign. As a concluding remark, I would say that Karel-Heinz Frieser makes it look like Germany had little fighting chance against the Western Allies. He would almost get the impression from his work that Germany won by mostly sheer luck. I disagree with this premise. Although the odds were against Germany in terms of production and mobilization, it did have a chance if it would strike at the Allies' weak point and exploit it with the necessary speed. The Germans took the time to recover their strength after the Polish campaign, and the German ultimate plan came to fruition after a series of serious discussions in the German General Staff, which were concluded by Hitler's decision to support the Manstein Plan. He ensured Manstein's plan, which was in line with his own ideas, prevailed and resulted in one of the most stunning victories in the history of warfare. In the spring of 1940, the world's two most modern armies were soundly defeated. The German victory could have been bigger if they would have encircled the British expeditionary force. But either way, Germany would dominate Western Europe for 4 long years until American support made a large-scale landing in France possible. After June 1940, Hitler felt that his strategic position was secure enough in the West to invade the Soviet Union, where the bulk of his army would remain until the end of the war.